And yet the progressive movement, among other things, but particularly this area, has targeted it. Federalism. They want a centralized power. They want uniform rules. Whereas you have federal departments and agencies today that are more powerful than the states, right?
Right, exactly. And one of the ways in which they attack it is, first of all, they'll refer to it through the reference to states' rights. There are a couple of reasons why I think they do this. Number one, it has a certain George Wallace feel to it. Harkens back to an unfortunate era where federalism was abused in order to accomplish some bad things. But when they do this, when they say that federalism is bad because it was sometimes used to do bad things, well, so has the federal government. The federal government has itself been abused in order to accomplish bad purposes. The federal government itself facilitated and perpetuated slavery for a long time, and a whole lot of other bad things as well. The fact that something is abused through government should not be surprising. What's important about federalism is that it is politically agnostic. It's neither Republican nor Democratic. It's neither liberal nor conservative. The other problem that their reference to that overlooks in calling it states' rights, it's not the states that have rights, it's the individual. It's individual liberty that we seek to protect when we do this. That's why I don't ever refer to it as a states' rights issue. It's a federalism issue. It's the right of an individual to be governed by the appropriate level of government, to have the appropriate decision maker be involved.
No, I think this is a very, very important point. And you can also, at least theoretically, influence the government the more local it is. But the other point is, if they do something in Massachusetts you don't like, you don't have to live in Massachusetts.
That's exactly right. People can vote with their feet.
And they do, and they are.
And they do. It was always intended to create a sort of competitive system, one in which states could compete in the marketplace of ideas. And if one state figured out something that worked really well, that state was going to benefit as a result. Other states would follow if they chose that thing. But the magic of federalism, and the point that I make in this book and in my last book, has been that more people in America would get more of the kind of government they want and less of the kind of government they don't want if we followed federalism. It's easier to turn around a personal watercraft, a jet ski, than it is an aircraft carrier. Well, the federal government is the aircraft carrier in that analogy. It's very difficult to turn around. That is not to say that local governments always make the right decision. Sometimes they make exactly the wrong decision, but they're easier to turn around. They're more responsive to the people. They can be changed more quickly. That's good for individual liberty.
And as a parallel point, do you agree with what the late Milton Friedman said, that the more the government gets involved in decisions, the more divided the country is? Because when you have these diffused decisions you don't have to make compromises, you don't have to work out deals, and there's not a party that feels that they're lost, a political party or some group or some entity, which is the great aspect of having these decisions made in the private sector by individuals as much as possible, whereas the federal government, like Obamacare, awful lot of people despise it. An awful lot of people are not benefited by it. A small percentage, maybe. And his point is, well, not only is it bad, but it divides the country. You agree with that?
Absolutely, I do. And that's one of the reasons why we so badly need federalism. It's one of the reasons why I dedicated a chapter to talking about Elbridge Gerry.
Let's talk about him. I'm familiar with. Go ahead.
Yes, Elbridge Gerry was a big believer in federalism and a big protector of individual liberty as well. Elbridge Gerry proposed a version of what became the 10th Amendment that would have been a little more aggressive. It would have said all powers not expressly granted to Congress. And he believed that, and
right.
He was absolutely right. James Madison, unfortunately, made the decision to remove the word expressly from that sentence. So what became the 10th Amendment was something that gave the federal government a little bit more play in the joints. Now, at the time he made the decision, and for about 150 years after that, federalism was still protected because we followed it, we understood it. But starting about 150 years after that amendment was put in place, we started to drift away from it, to the point now where we've almost rendered the 10th Amendment ineffective. We've almost nullified it from a practical standpoint. But once people understand that this is already part of our Constitution, and it's part of the history of the Constitution, part of what those who helped form the Constitution, like Elbridge Gerry, saw, once they know the stories behind it, they can help restore the principle of federalism. As to Obamacare, this is a great example of where federalism ought to come into play. I have it on good authority that a majority of the people in Vermont would much prefer a single-payer, government-run, government-funded healthcare system. Now, this is one of the reasons why I'm not likely to move to Vermont. But look, if the people of Vermont want that, I say let them do it. They could do it, and they could go there a lot more effectively, efficiently, quickly, if the federal government weren't occupying so much of the field of healthcare already. People in other states, say Utah, where I live, would never go for that. There are also vast differences, not just in political ideology and economics and how people view their relationship with government, but also with things like how healthcare is delivered and how much it costs. These things vary dramatically from one state to another. So in light of those differences, it makes no sense to create a single national system, whether it's Obamacare or a national single-payer system or something akin to that. It makes no difference at all for this even to be a federal issue. Sure, I'm fine if we come up with a few regulations that can make things somewhat consistent so that there aren't too many differences, so that there's not too much uncertainty when someone wants to move from state to state or when someone wants to purchase health insurance across state lines. There is a limited federal role to play there. But the federal government should never be in the business of just occupying the entire field.
So why don't most Republicans in Congress believe this?
They do. They've all campaigned on that. We have all campaigned for the last 7 years on the fact that...
But they don't do anything.
Well, that remains to be seen, and that's one of the things I've been pushing for. We do have to repeal Obamacare, having campaigned for 7 years on how bad Obamacare is, on how much it has escalated the cost of health care. We now have to actually repeal it. It is a great frustration to me, though, that we don't hear as many of the arguments as we had during previous stages of those 7 years.
One senator who said the other day, and I won't put you on the spot, but one senator said the other day, it's not going to happen this year.
I just completely disagree, and I wonder, I'm actually not sure which one you're referring to, but I wonder about what that person meant and why that person can be so sure that nothing is going to happen. Now, the American people elected President Trump and elected a Republican Senate and elected a Republican House of Representatives with the understanding that the biggest single thing that would be different if we were elected would be that we would repeal Obamacare. We repealed Obamacare, as much of it as we believed we could at the time, in December of 2015. We submitted that to President Obama, who vetoed it. Why should we pass anything less aggressive toward repealing Obamacare now than we did then?
Well, you're quite right, but you have a small percentage of Republicans who voted that way when they didn't think it would be signed and won't vote that way now. So it's very, very cynical, at least in that regard. Give us a little bit of background about Gerry.
Elbridge Gerry was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He was from Marblehead, Massachusetts. He was a good man. He was a man who cared deeply about his country. He was a man who was deeply ethical. He would oppose certain actions to be taken by government, even when they might inure to his own economic interest, if they conflicted with what he believed would be in the interest of the people as a whole, and if he believed they would degrade liberty. He had some concerns about the Constitution, especially the Constitution prior to the Bill of Rights. It's one of the reasons why he expressed those concerns, and one of the reasons why his recommendations about how the Constitution should be changed are still very valid today. One of the things I love about Elbridge Gerry that I talk about a little bit in my book is he raised some concerns specifically with regard to the power that Congress would have over federal public land. What we now call the Enclave Clause, Clause 17 of Article 1, Section 8, gives Congress vast power to control federal public land, to be basically the sole sovereign lawmaking body over that land. In response to his concerns, he said, look, this was in September of 1787, toward the end of the convention. He said the federal government could one day purchase a whole bunch of land in a particular state and use this immense power that we proposed in the Enclave Clause to compel those states to a humble obedience to the general government. In response to that, they put some language in there that said that that power would exist only where the land was purchased by the consent of a host state's legislature. That language, alas, has been largely ignored, and that's one of the reasons why in states like mine, where the federal government owns 2/3 of the land, we have become beholden to federal land managers. A small handful of government bureaucrats in Washington control most of the land in my state. If we had listened more closely to Elbridge Gerry and the concerns he raised, we wouldn't be in that position.